Thank you, Hugh. Appreciate the wonderful songs that we've been led in as we have all day yesterday. Of course, I was about to say all week. We mentioned that we were halfway through with this meeting at the close of last night's lesson, and it's easy to think that we've been here longer than we have with all of the studies that we've done, but the worship has been wonderful. The leading of singing, the prayers that have been offered, I can't express my appreciation enough, as well as for the hospitality. I appreciate the Bud and Shelley. They've been so hospitable in keeping us as they did last time that I was here. Thankful that I'm able to have Jennifer with me this time, and of course my whole crew came in on them over the weekend and was able to be here. I can't tell you the last time, I can't even remember the last time that all of my kids were able to be with me at a gospel meeting, so it was very special to have them here yesterday. And that leads me to proudly announce that my mom and sister have driven down from Oklahoma City to be here, and they'll be with us tonight and Lord willing tomorrow night, so I hope you get to meet them. Just appreciate them making that trip, and again Bud and Shelley for being so hospitable to take care of us all. I've appreciated the wonderful meals throughout this weekend, and those of you that I've been able to be with, and of course to be with Stephen and Christy, and the folks that we were able to be with tonight was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. This has been a good meeting for me so far, and I hope that the study has been helpful for you. I want to ask you to open your Bibles, though, to Philippians chapter 1 this evening. We're going to begin our study there in Philippians chapter 1. And I want you to begin reading with me in verse 3, in Philippians chapter 1 and in verse 3. The Apostle Paul says, "I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, making a request for you all with joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. Just as it is right for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, inasmuch as both in my chains and in defense and confirmation of the gospel, you all are partakers with me of this grace. For God is my witness, how greatly I long for you all with the affection of Jesus Christ. And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in knowledge and all discernment, that you may approve the things that are excellent, that you may be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ, being filled with the fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ to the glory and the praise of God." Now, this is a lengthy text, but I want to make some observations about this as we look at the context. We start by looking at Paul expressing the affection he had for the brethren at Philippi, and he mentions his remembrance of them in verse 3, and it would remind us of his conversion of Lydia and the jailer there in Acts chapter 16. And I would expect that with everything that Paul went through in that city, that he would never forget the love and the fellowship and what he shared with the brethren there. And so then he mentions in verses 5 through 7 their fellowship in the gospel. And of course we know from chapter 4 and verses 14 through 18 that the church at Philippi supported Paul financially in the preaching of the gospel. And so I know that would be a portion of what Paul's talking about here when he mentions their fellowship with him in the gospel. But I want to suggest to you that there's more to it than that. The supporting a gospel preacher financially in his work is not the only way that we have fellowship with an evangelist in the gospel. I want to suggest to you that the most important way that we have fellowship with one who teaches the truth is to obey the same truth that they have obeyed and are teaching. Because this word fellowship is the word koinonia. It means literally to share in, to partake together in. And so yes, they were partaking of the work and the fruit of his labor in preaching the gospel, but more importantly, they were partaking in the gospel by learning it, by obeying it, by being transformed by it. And I want to say that that's the most important fellowship that you can have with me this week. That's why we're having this gospel meeting, is not only to teach the lost, but to teach and edify and encourage the saved, that we would participate more and more in the gospel. And then Paul, in verse 8, speaks about the affection that he had for them was the affection of Jesus. And what he means by that is, it was the same kind of affection that Jesus had for them. In what way? Well, first of all, it was a sacrificial affection. He speaks about that in chapter 4 and in verse 12, where he says, I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I've learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. Paul had suffered in order for them to hear the gospel. And we see in chapter 1 and in verse 7, remember where he says in this greeting, he says, both in my chains and in defense and confirmation of the gospel. Paul was in chains when he wrote this. So the affection of Jesus is the affection of one who is sacrificial, the affection of one who's willing to suffer for the good of another. Paul had a deep affection for the brethren there, and I think that we can all relate to this. Working with brethren in a particular place, you working with one another. Maybe you've had to move away for a while and you come back and you just can't wait to see one another. We have some visitors in the audience, some young families, or they're young families to me, that they were college students in Lubbock when Jennifer and I, early on when we moved there to work with the congregation there, and now we're seeing their kids grown. And I'm telling you, the affection that I have, as I've spoken about with the Slaybaws, to work with people for that many years, to see the changes, the successes, the temporary failures, but recoveries, that's an affection that cannot be replaced. But Paul also speaks about his prayer for the brethren there in the city of Philippi. And when he speaks about his prayer for them, he said that his prayer was that their love would abound still more and more in knowledge and in all discernment. That's an important concept. That their love would abound. That word abound, that's an interesting word. It means to superabound. Literally. It means to excel more, to get greater and greater in what they're doing. And it wasn't that they didn't already love, and it wasn't that they didn't already have knowledge and discernment, but he said, I want you to have an abundance of this. And why? He said, so that you will approve things that are excellent. Wow, that's a key. That's why this topic that we're looking at this evening is so very important, is because the importance of abounding in, that our love would abound in knowledge and in discernment, is that we may approve things that are excellent. You say, well, I think that I already am. Well, in order to be sure, we need to abound still more and more. And not only that, he said, I want you to be sincere and without offense. The word translated sincere there is a word that conveys the idea of purity. And then he says that you would be filled with the fruits of righteousness. Now, that's an important thing. Be filled with the fruits of righteousness. But what is necessary in order for us to accomplish that? Well, our love needs to abound in knowledge and in discernment. That's what he's calling on us to do, as well as the brethren there in Philippi, to abound still more and more in knowledge and in discernment. You know, the Bible obviously teaches about the importance of love. You look in 1 Corinthians 13. Love is going to abide forever. It's not something that has had a temporary purpose like the spiritual gifts. And it is even more lasting. It is more lasting than faith and hope, for they will be replaced with a reality. But love, it will always be there. We're told about love being the bond of perfection in Colossians 3 and in verse 14. Isn't that great? The Apostle Paul would write to the Thessalonian brethren in 1 Thessalonians 3 in verses 12 through 13, and he would say, may the Lord make you increase and abound in love to one another and to all, just as we do to you, so that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and Father. Here again, I want to be established. I want to be set solid. You know, that word established, that's an interesting word. It reminds me of building fence as a kid, helping my dad to build a fence, and we'd tamp those posts in because, especially the corners, they had to hold a lot of pressure. And that's the idea of this word establish. It means to tamp down and to make solid. And in order for us to be solid Christians, what's he saying? You need to abound and increase in your love for one another. We can't emphasize that enough. It is the bond of perfection. Yes, love never fails. 1 Corinthians 13 and in verse 8. In verse 13, now abide faith, hope, love, these three. But the greatest of these is love. But when we talk about abounding, our love abounding in knowledge and in all discernment, that's where this is one of those passages, and I'm sure you've had these, where you're reading through the Bible, you're looking at a particular passage, you're taking in the context, and you read past a verse and you think, oh, there's more there than what I've realized. I don't really have time right now because I'm working on this, but I need to come back to that. Maybe you put a marker by it. And you forget to get back to it, and then you're reading through it again, and it hits you again. And eventually, you stop and you take the time to dig and to find that pearl that's there. And that's what I hope that we're going to do tonight with this text, with this verse in particular. Love abounding in knowledge and discernment. You see, the proper love, when he speaks about love abounding in 1 Thessalonians 3, when he speaks about love being the bond of perfection and the fact that love never fails, he's not talking about an ignorant love. He's talking about a love wherein we know what we love and we know why we love. You know, I've had a number of studies with couples preparing for marriage and done several weddings, and some of the ones that I mentioned here earlier performed their wedding and have had some studies, and generally in those studies, one of the things that I will ask the couple early on, I'll ask them if they love each other. And I've never had anyone say, not really. They always just give the biggest smile on their face and look at each other and just kind of act a little embarrassed, and yes. And so then I say, can you tell me why you love them? And sometimes it kind of stumps people, It's like, I don't know. It's just there, I don't know how to put it into words. Well, you better figure it out. You need to know why you love this person, because it's going to be tested, and you need to come back to that and remember, this is why I love them, There's some things about that person that draws you to them. But here's the problem. The world has convinced a lot of people that love is not an intellectual thing at all. It's not something that you could abound in knowledge and discernment in regards to, because it's more of a feeling. It's more of an emotion. It's just an affection, and that's simply not biblically true. Love is an emotion, not simply an emotion. He tells us that our love needs to abound in knowledge. We love God with all of our heart, mind, and soul. We know who we love, and we know why. Our love is not blind. Our love is not merely a feeling or an emotion. And so it's got to abound in knowledge. We need to know who we love and why we love them. And also it needs to abound in discernment. That word discernment is defined as the ability to judge well. And so when we have a love that is discerning, that means that we're going to see things as they are, and that's what I'm trying to cut through in studying with young couples that say that they love each other, but they're not really sure why. They need to see things as they are, because there can be a lot of things that can confuse us and make us think that we love somebody when it's really more of an infatuation, and we're familiar with that. When maybe it's more of a popularity thing or whatever it might be. So we need to be able to see things as they are. We need to be able to see this person objectively. We can still love them. We can still whisper sweet nothings and have all kinds of butterflies and still see this person objectively. This love sees dangers, but it also sees potential. That's a love that abounds in knowledge and in all discernment. You see, the problem is, you say, well, Brett, that doesn't sound very romantic. Well, I want to tell you, it actually is. And this is the kind of love that will bring two people together that will stay together. A love that abounds in knowledge and discernment. And this is the kind of love that builds churches. This is the kind of love that makes marriages, churches, and relationships solid. Yes, the word and the idea of love is being hijacked and misused to accommodate every form of error and selfish worldliness. People claiming that, well, we just want to love. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And they completely misuse that passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and in verse 1 to indicate that we don't need to worry about what we know. We just need to love each other. And that's not at all what that text is saying. 1 Corinthians chapter 8 is talking about matters of indifference to God, whether a person eats meat sacrificed to an idol or doesn't eat it. It's of no matter to God. It's a matter of liberty. It's a matter of opinion. And in that case, it really doesn't matter whether we know it or don't know it. What matters is that we love one another well enough that we're not going to cause one another to stumble. That's the context of that. But this idea of love is being hijacked, and the text is going to help us to understand the love that Christians are to have and the characteristics of that study. So our study is going to center on love abounding with knowledge and all discernment and the things that will result. So biblical love is based on knowledge and it is discerning. You say, well, in what ways? Let's look at a few of those. First of all, I want to talk about this romantic love, falling in love with someone. When two people are trying to determine who they're going to marry, and they meet someone, they're deeply attracted to them, and they are impressed, and they realize that there's a lot of things that would work very well together with them, and this attraction brings them together. That love grows. This is a process leading to marriage that, for lack of a better term, we typically call dating. And it is in this period where love is beginning to grow, and there are a lot of emotions being mixed up in there. There are a lot of things happening. There are a lot of temptations. There are a lot of challenges, and Satan is at work full bore to try to corrupt that relationship. And it is in this place that we need to be especially mindful that our love, as it's growing, would abound. I mean, increase, superabound in knowledge and in all discernment. There is an empty love. In Proverbs chapter 7 and in verse 18, we read about the young man who was devoid of understanding, and he wandered near the house of the immoral woman. And it says in Proverbs 7 and in verse 18 that the woman said to him, "Come, let us take our fill of love until morning. Let us delight ourselves with love." That wasn't love at all. That was fleshly lust, is what that was. And yet it was called love. And that's why I say the word has been hijacked. Were there emotions that were involved? Absolutely. Was there some excitement? Was the dopamine there? Everything was there, but it wasn't love. That's empty. That's empty. And I want you to realize, and I don't have to tell you, I'm sure, that in this relationship of dating, that those feelings, those attractions, those affections are going to be powerful. They're going to be strong. And there are going to be temptations with those. And so young people need to know, and their love needs to abound in knowledge and discernment so that they know and discern the dangers and the pitfalls of this relationship of dating. In Hebrews chapter 13 and in verse 4, the inspired writer says, "Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled." It's pure. "But fornicators and adulterers God will judge." Fornication is that sexual intimacy that is outside a lawful marriage. One where God joins two people together. And he says that there's going to be an accountability. There's going to be a judgment for that. And this is the trial. This is the temptation that is there, because those feelings, that affection, that admiration, that attraction, all of that is there. That love is there. But we need to have it abound in knowledge and discernment regarding the dangers and the pitfalls. Going back to Proverbs chapter 7, in this context, it begins in verse 7. It says, I saw among the simple, I perceived among the youths a young man devoid of what? Understanding. That's that discernment. That's that knowledge. Here's a young man that did not have that. And so the young man falls to the temptation of this married woman, this immoral woman whose husband is gone on a trip. And it says in verse 21, Proverbs 7, verse 21, with her enticing speech, she caused him to yield. With her flattering lips, she seduced him. Immediately he went after her as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a fool to the correction of the stocks, till an arrow struck his liver. As a bird hastens to the snare, he did not know it would cost his life. Now therefore listen to me, my children. Pay attention to the words of my mouth. What's he doing? He's giving knowledge. He's imparting discernment about this temptation, this trial. He says, do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths, for she has cast down many wounded, and all who were slain by her were strong men. Her house is the way to hell, descending to the chambers of death. This young man did not understand the consequences, many times lifelong consequences, of a failure in this regard. Love is beautiful, but Satan is at work where he sees that relationship growing, and he's going to try to take that and drain it of everything good with that temptation. Certainly God put within us that attraction. He put within us that sexual desire that is beautiful. The bed is undefiled in marriage, and we can look forward to that. But all of that must be reined in. It must be brought under the control of the knowledge and the discernment of the fact that it will be beautiful in its time. God makes all things beautiful in His time. But outside of the right time, it's not beautiful. It's going to be something that fills a person with years of guilt and of regret, of self-loathing and of sorrow. And it's not just in Proverbs 7. It actually starts back in Proverbs chapter 5 and in chapter 5 and chapter 6, chapter 7 and in chapter 9. He warns about this same danger, the pitfalls and the danger that we see here in Proverbs 5 and in verse 1. My son, pay attention to my wisdom, lend your ear to my understanding, that you may preserve discretion and your lips may keep knowledge. And then he goes on, for the lips of an immoral woman drip honey, her mouth is smoother than oil, but in the end she's bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. All of these are telling us about the dangers of sexual temptation and how it attacks a person in one of the most beautiful times of their life. In Romans chapter 13, there's an important passage that this is not speaking about dating specifically. It's not speaking about alcohol specifically or about gambling or about anything like that, but it is a general principle. The Bible's so good at giving us these general principles, and they're applied to a specific thing. But the fact that it's applied to a specific thing does not take away its general truth as applied everywhere. He says here in Romans chapter 13, beginning in verse 13, let us walk properly as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. That's a pretty general truth there. I want you to apply it to this dating, this love-growing relationship, and understand the dangers that are there. And what he's saying is, don't make provision for this fleshly desire. What does that mean, make provision? You know, the Holmes have made provisions for Jennifer and I, for our family. They made it to where it is comfortable to stay there. They made it easy for us to be there. And that's what we do when we show hospitality. We want guests to feel comfortable, so we make all these provisions for them. And the Lord says, you know, there's a way that you can do that with fleshly desire. When you're listening to music that is explicit or even sexually suggestive, when you're watching movies, you're going out on a date with someone that you're incredibly attracted to, maybe they're not even dressed modestly, and you're watching a movie that has all kinds of sexually suggestive material or scenes, you might as well put a gun to your head. What he's telling us is, don't make those provisions for the flesh to fulfill its lust. You're creating an environment to make it stronger. You're putting coal in the train engine, and you're going to pay for it. Yes, we've got to realize that there are some things that we need to be mindful of and careful of. Don't do those things that are going to make provision for the flesh to fulfill its lust. That's going to have to do with the way that we dress. If you're dating someone that's dressing immodest, you need to ask them not to do that and explain why. Help them to understand if they don't understand it. And you need to explain why you're not going to go to certain movies. There's going to be some entertainment that you don't take part in. When you're not married, you cannot afford to make provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. One of the things that I would preach regularly to the young people there in Lubbock and working with them on this is that you can be assured that if you keep yourself in the public eye, wherever you're at, when you're with that person that you're not married to, but you're attracted to them, always be in the public eye. I don't think you're ever going to have to worry about this problem. But you go back to their apartment alone, it's crazy. To stir up those emotions, this is not love. This is what Satan supplies to destroy what is truly love. In 1 Peter chapter 2, he says in verse 11, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. And I know you're thinking, well, man, Brett, this is a downer. I want to enjoy being young and dating, and I understand it. In Ecclesiastes chapter 11, he gives this wisdom. In Ecclesiastes 11 and in verse 9, he says, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. I want you to enjoy this time. That's why I'm sharing this with you. He says, walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these, God will bring you into judgment. Therefore, remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. I want you to understand how important and how serious this time is. You need to protect the other person's honor and purity for their future mate. You say, well, that's going to be me. Sometimes it's not. You don't know that. It might be someone else, and you might end up worshiping with them someday and looking at them across the building. Did you protect that person's honor and their purity? There are all kinds of consequences to this. You want to live your life in your youth to where you enjoy it, but that you can also tell your children about it and enjoy sharing it with them without shame. You want to be able to look back on your past with sweet memories, not with regret. And going along with this, let me say that love abounding in knowledge and discernment is going to know and discern the value of the other person. The value. This overlaps what we're just talking about. But in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verses 1 through 2, Paul told Timothy, do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, with all purity. Now, both my boys still say, Dad, I don't want to date my sister. That's not what he's saying there, and I think that we understand that. What he's saying is that there is a certain way that you conduct yourself around your own flesh and blood. The way a young man treats his sister is with all purity, and I realize that there's exceptions to all of these things. But the way that we would treat a sister, it can be loving, it can be affectionate, we can have fun, we can enjoy their company, but it is always pure and right before God. What he's saying is that, young men, you need to have that same value for every young woman that you encounter, that you're with. Treat her with honor and with value. That's the key to having a pleasant and an enjoyable dating life. Treat them with purity and with respect. Matthew chapter 7, he says in verse 12, therefore, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. Dating is not a sport. It's not seeing how many people you can go out with and if you can break up with them before they break up with you. A lot of people are deeply hurt by these breakups, and sometimes they're necessary. You realize this is not going where it needs to go, and we need to end this. You don't need to jump out of the frying pan into the fire, as they say. But be conscientious of that person. Be mindful of their honor. Be mindful of how this is going to impact them. Be honest. Be true. Be kind. Treat them with purity and respect. This is growing a love that abounds in knowledge and discernment, and that understands that I'm very likely going to know this person for many years to come. I want to have a good relationship with them, whether I'm married to them or they're a brother or sister in Christ someday. This is knowledge and discernment. You know, there's another area where this needs to be done, and that is after marriage, in a husband's love for his wife. You know, the Lord tells us by way of the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 5 and verse 25 that husbands are to love their wife as Christ loved the church. That's not an empty love. That is a love that abounds in knowledge and discernment. And of course, there's an empty love there as well that husbands may have for their wife. They talk about loving their wife, and yet they treat them with abuse and claim to love her. Or a husband neglects his wife for his own selfish pursuit of work, of career, or of a hobby, and claims to love her. That's not a love that abounds in knowledge and discernment. That's not even love. That is empty love. It's void of what is truly love. No, a love that the husband is to have for the wife, the love that Christ had for the church, is a love that knows and discerns her value. In Proverbs 31, listen to what the king's mother told him. In verse 10 of Proverbs 31, "Who can find a virtuous wife? For her worth is far above rubies. The heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life." Young men, you cannot put a price on that. To have a wife that you can trust, that when she tells you something, you can rest assured that's what she's going to do, that's where she's been, that's who she talked to, that's what she said. There are going to be situations in the church where a problem arises, and you need to know what was said in this conversation. You need to know that you can trust her. There are men who have wives that when they go out to the grocery store, they cannot be sure that she won't trade glances with a stranger or flirt with the cashier or be dressed in a way that she ought to be dressed. I've known far too many people like that, and I've seen the sorrow and the sadness and the hurt and the insecurity in their life. There is no amount of money that can provide what a godly woman provides. And so we need to know and to discern that value. We need to understand how valuable, truly valuable that is. In Proverbs 18 and verse 22, the wise man said that he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. Godly wife, absolutely. It is a gift of God. Genesis 2 and verse 18, "It is not good that man should be alone." And so when we have that knowledge, when our love abounds, not just in the way that we feel about her, but we actually know her worth, we actually discern what is valuable about her, then we're going to praise her for her value. And that again is in Proverbs 31, beginning in verse 27. It says, "She watches over the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many daughters have done well, but you excel them all. Charm is deceitful, beauty is passing, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates." I cannot emphasize this enough, husbands, that you need to know and discern your wife's value, and you need to express that. You need to tell her that. You need to tell your children that. You need to praise her in the gates. Tell people, because I want to tell you, no one else is going to. Not in this world, not in this culture. A woman who provides for her family and is a manager of the home, who sacrifices so much to raise those children and to be a helpmeet to her husband, she's going to be scorned and ridiculed by most people in this world. She's going to be made to feel like she's missed out or that she's lesser because of the choices that she made. She needs your praise. That's what she craves. That's what she wants. And your children are going to be convicted. They're going to be convinced of that value and seek the same valuable thing when you praise your wife to your children, in front of your children. Your daughters will expect and look for a man who has the right value for his wife instead of putting herself in an abusive relationship because her father had the right value. These kinds of things live on for generations and generations. But this is a love that abounds in knowledge and in discernment. And it is one that not only praises, but it makes sacrifice for her in service. And it is a knowledge and a discernment that knows her. You know, men sometimes joke or say, well, I can never understand my wife. Or women are crazy. Who can understand them? And that might make people laugh, but it's really not funny. Women are not crazy, any crazier than men are. We're different. Men and women are different. And we are valuable because we're different. We need to be different to complement one another. That's the way that God made us. We're a complement to one another. That makes us different. But we come together to make that perfect union that only God could have designed. So quit complaining about the fact that you don't understand this or understand that and start trying to get it. There are going to be some things that you're not necessarily going to feel that she feels, but you can know that she does feel that way about that. And you need to act accordingly. It's all about caring enough to find out. Men, there are a lot of things that we care about and we can do a lot of research on. We can patiently figure it out. We can patiently know what is involved in this. We need to have that kind of love that we are going to seek to know our wife. And when I say to know her, I mean to know her in a way that to know her intellectually, obviously, to understand what her interests are, but to know her emotionally. There may be a reason in her childhood that this makes her feel insecure. Find out and act accordingly. And take care of that. Make her feel secure. And not only emotionally, but spiritually. Where is she at in her faith? Some of these godly women are so busy with children during worship services, in and out of the cry room, that they barely hear just tidbits of a sermon here and there. You need to be taking the time to study with them and to encourage them and to know where they're at in their faith instead of waiting until there's a 4-alarm fire and you see her falling apart and you don't understand why she's been to church with. I've been with her every time. She's dealing with a lot of different things than you are. So we need to know where she is spiritually. Yes, we need to know her intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, and not just physically. That's why Peter would write in 1 Peter 3 and in verse 7, husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel. That word honor means value. And that understanding, that's the knowledge and discernment. And without it, our prayers will be hindered. Yes, we must have that kind of love for our wife. But then, obviously, the next thing we might look at is a parent's love for their children. You know, there is an empty love here as well. That is, parents that claim to love their children, and yet there is abuse in the home. Or maybe there is some form of neglect. And maybe it's through selfishness. Both parents are so busy, they're coming and going, and they're handing off children to one another, and the kids are just watching it all happen. They're floating on stress because of all of the temporal things that their parents are involved in. And their parents think that they're making up for it by involving their kids in 100 different sports, and now their kids are even more stressed. The parents think that they're giving their kids everything that they didn't have, and all that kid wants is their parents' time. And it doesn't have to be in organized sports. just throw a ball to them. Just sit down with them and ask them some questions. Go for a ride. Just take them with you to mow someone's yard or to help somebody. Ask them to help you prepare a meal and talk to them about other things while you're doing it. Show them how to change the oil in the car, but talk to them about their own life while you're doing those things. I tell you, that is what is needed. But in order to do that, we have to know and discern the value of our children. You know, notice in the 127th Psalm where the psalmist says in verses 3 through 5, in the 127th Psalm, beginning in verse 3, the psalmist says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward." Listen to verse 4. "Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate." He uses that metaphor, arrows and quiver. I think it's really neat. What does that mean? Like arrows in the hand of a warrior. I'm not going to suggest that I've plumbed the depths of this or that I know in every way, but I'll tell you one way that children are like arrows in the hand of a warrior. A warrior takes that arrow, he draws it back on the string in that bow, he sets a trajectory for that arrow to hit a particular mark. The archer, the warrior, knows exactly how to put that arrow where he wants it to go, but it all begins with drawing it back, setting the trajectory, and eventually letting it go. And parents, that's what we're doing with our children. And it is such a short window of time that we draw them back and set that trajectory. And when we let them go, that's where they're going to go. For the most part, children have free will. But if we send them on the wrong trajectory and they go right, it takes a great deal of effort on their part to do that, to overcome that. But if we set them on the right trajectory, it takes a great deal of effort to overcome that and to do the wrong thing. Yes, we set our kids out here, and that's why we need to spend that time. We need to know them. We need to know where they need to go. We need to have an understanding of who they are. And as a matter of fact, in the next psalm, in the 128th Psalm, and in verse 3, he says, "Your wife shall be like a fruitful vine in the heart of your house, your children like olive plants all around your table." That's culturally, that doesn't mean the same thing to us that it did in an Eastern culture. But what he's talking about is the value of family, the value of those children, the value of the wife. And when we know and we discern their value, we're going to understand that this meeting or this trip, this travel, this promotion, what's going on right now in my career will never come close to the value of the time that I have with my children right now. The time that I can spend asking them questions about their faith, talking about the Bible, and making the Lord real to them. That takes time. And I'm not saying that you've got to say, okay, I'm gonna schedule 3 hours on Thursday. I won't see them the rest of the week, but we need some time. That's not how it works. It's consistency. It's caring. It's longing to be with them. And they know when you want to be with them. They know when you want to let other things go. You don't have to keep looking at your phone. You have time to inquire and to talk and to study and to tell them what the Lord has done for you and about what you've been praying about and how the Lord has answered those prayers. Those are the kinds of conversations that we need to have with our children when we know and discern them. They need that time. We need to know their value. I want to suggest another thing that we need to know and discern, and that is we need to know the connection between love and discipline. In Proverbs chapter 13 and in verse 24, the wise man said, "He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly." This idea of discipline, I want to emphasize that discipline is not just punitive. Discipline is training. And that's going to be putting your arm around them and telling them you love them. That's going to be telling them that they can do this and you can help them. That they're better than they think they are. That you're going to show them how they're going to win this or overcome this. You're going to lift them up when they've fallen down. but it's also going to be correction. And sometimes it's going to be painful, punitive correction. The wise man speaks about that being done by way of the rod. But before we get to that, in Hebrews 12, in verses 5 through 11, the Hebrew writer says, "My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives." In verse 8, "If you're without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you're illegitimate, not sons." Verse 9, "We've had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect." And then he says in verse 11, "No chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who've been trained by it." I understand different children require different amounts of that kind of training, but I have not known one that hasn't needed some. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, Proverbs 22 and verse 15. The rod of correction drives it far from them. Clearly, some children, it doesn't take much, and they get it. But when we begin to think that we are wiser than God, and that was the old times, and children just don't need that today. And I've actually heard about young couples today within the church that are saying, we do not believe in corporal punishment. Proverbs chapter 13 said that if we are not willing to use that type of training, that's not the only type. Certainly there's a whole lot more to it than that. But if we're not willing to use that, we do not love our children. That is an empty love. It's a convenient love. It's a lazy love. And it is a destructive thing that is falsely called love. Brethren, the reason that I'm passionate about this is because we're living in a culture and a time where this is being canceled out. And if anyone's going to hear anything about it, it's going to be from God's Word, and we need to preach it. We need to teach what God said about this. We need to convict, and we need to help families find their way in a world where children are lost. There's very little respect. There's very little training. Now, do not misunderstand me. What is needed when I'm talking about the rod of correction will drive it far from them. What is needed absolutely is not just going in there and using a rod or a switch, a corporal punishment on a kid, and well, that's going to fix it. No, what you need is consistency, and that's what's lacking in most of the families that are failing. And then there is a need for a deep, genuine love that goes along with that. And then a deep, genuine interest. Your kids can tell if you're interested in them. And then a deep, genuine, determined will to win. And some parents just don't have it. They don't have the will to win. Their kid's going to outlast them. And it's going to be Katie bar the door. And I want to tell you, parent, you're going to be held accountable. You were blessed. It was a heritage from God. You were blessed with a child. You'd better man up, and you'd better have the will to win that training session. And this is what God has given us. The wisdom to know is that He tells us in Proverbs 19 and verse 18, "Chasten your son while there is hope, and do not set your heart on his destruction." In Proverbs 23 and verse 13, "Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell." You know, as a kid, I didn't know that was true. I thought I might die. That's part of the power of it. I was like, I don't ever want to go through that again. And somehow I would. I don't know what was wrong with me, but I got there. I got there. But what it took was, it wasn't just the corporal punishment. And this is where I think a lot of parents misunderstand. There are parents who were raised in a family where there was no love involved in that punitive correction, and they say, I don't believe that works. Well, that doesn't work. Or they were involved where it was only done with anger and it was inconsistent. No, that doesn't work either. That's not my argument. My argument is it does work when it is coupled with consistency, a deep, genuine love, a deep, genuine interest, and a determined will to win, and a wholehearted devotion to that child to set them on the trajectory they need to be on. Because sometimes the only thing that is going to help them break through that wall is a cleansing. Proverbs 20 and in verse 30 says, blows that hurt cleanse away evil, as do stripes the inner depths of the heart. I've had a lot of people tell me, well, that just didn't work with this kid. They need to read Proverbs 20:30. They need to turn the temperature up. And provided that they have brought all these other things into play, the consistency and the love and the interest. Yes, parents, we cannot fail in this regard. But let me also say that we need to know our children and discern their areas of strength and build on their anchors. I say that because every one of your kids is different. They're like oranges and apples. Not a one of them is better than the other. They're just different. And because of that, you need to know them well enough to know that this kid's strength is not this kid's strength. The way that this kid communicates is not the way that this child communicates. And you'd better be mindful enough and careful enough and sacrificial enough to take the time to figure out how to communicate with that child and care. Care about what they're good at. And here's what's going to throw you for a loop. What they're really good at and what they're interested in, you might not know anything about. You might not be interested in it. And this kid over here loves what you love. They want to do what you did when you were a kid. And the temptation is going to be to focus on that kid and to effectively show some favoritism. God forbid. Every one of your children are equally valuable. And show them that. Show them that interest. No favoritism. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4. Fathers, train up your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And in order to do that, you need to demonstrate your genuine interest in your children. What do they care about? What are they thinking about? What happened today at school? Not just a short answer. And don't think that you're going to be able to sit down and debrief them like you could some kind of FBI agent. Your children are going to talk to you when you least expect it. It's going to be when they're out there helping you in the yard. It's going to be when you're doing something else and you're trying to figure out why this won't fit in here, and then they start talking to you, and it's terrible timing for you, and you need to just stop what you're doing and listen, because that opportunity may not come back. Know your children. Discern their value. Well, that leaves me to quickly move through this last point, and that is brotherly love needs to abound in knowledge and in discernment. Oh, there is an empty love we read about in James chapter 2 and verses 15 through 16. He said, if a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? You know, we say, well, I'm sure praying for you. We need to follow through. We need to check on them. What can we provide? No, love, brotherly love that is real, is based upon a knowledge. We need to know our brethren. And one of the greatest ways to do that is for us to spend time with them. He says in Romans 12 and in verses 9 through 10, let love be without hypocrisy, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good, be kindly affectionate to one another, with brotherly love and honor, giving preference to one another. Then in verse 15, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. You've got to know what's going on in their life. And one of the greatest ways to know what's going on in a person's life is to show hospitality. When you have them into your home, when you sit at your table or in your living room and you visit, you ask questions. When you can tell that there's something going on in their life, you can put your arm around them as you're going out of the building, but they may not tell you really what's going on at that point. Have them over. Ask them to meet you somewhere. We need that time to get to know one another. 1 Peter 4 and in verse 9, be hospitable to one another without grumbling. We need to know our brethren and what's happening in their life. And we need to be able to share and confess our faults one to another. That's brotherly love. And we also need to discern between matters of faith and matters of opinion. Oh, I want to tell you, I have plenty of opinions. Have them strongly. You might say, well, that's obvious. You're talking about children. You know, we've got to be able to understand the difference between matters of faith and matters of opinion. That brings me back to the passage I mentioned before in 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 1. He said, knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. There's some things that we may know that another person doesn't know, but it's a matter of indifference to God. We don't need to showcase that. What we need to do is to love our brother, and we need to be willing to help them, and we don't need to force our opinions on other people. We can feel strongly about a lot of things, but they don't have anything to do with the kingdom of Christ. Let's leave them out. Let's drop it. We need to talk about things that matter, spiritual things. Romans 14 is all about that in verses 1 through 23. And I want to tell you another thing about this love that abounds in knowledge and discernment. Not only do we discern between matters of faith and matters of opinion, but our discernment does not allow us to overlook sin. In 1 Corinthians in chapter 5, in verses 1 through 13, he rebukes the church at Corinth. He said it's actually reported that there's sexual immorality among you, and such sexual immorality is not even named among the Gentiles, that a man has his father's wife, and you're puffed up and have not rather mourned that he who has done this deed might be taken away from among you. Did you notice that? Puffed up. They were completely ignoring what was going on right there in their midst. We can never do that. Paul confronted Peter to his face because he was to be blamed. We have got to have a love that is willing to confront those things lovingly, many times privately first, but we've got to make sure that our love for one another is genuine and without hypocrisy. Love abounding in knowledge and in discernment. Paul's prayer for us is that our love will abound as well in knowledge and discernment, so that we will approve of things that are excellent. There can be no approving without first proving. We need to know what is excellent. And the way that we know those things is to abound in knowledge and discernment. And that we would be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ. That word sincere, it means without admixture. It's what we would call genuine, real, not a hypocrite. And that we would be filled with the fruits of righteousness. We would bear the fruit of the Spirit in our life in obedience to the gospel. But in order to truly do that, we need our love to abound in knowledge and discernment. I appreciate your kind attention, your patience with me and the time that I've taken, but I hope that tonight's study will help you to see the beautiful pearl hidden here in this text, and that you'll make the application of it. May your love abound in knowledge and all discernment. If you haven't obeyed the gospel, you can do that right now. We're going to sing a song that is designed to encourage you to respond to the gospel call of Jesus Christ, to believe in Him as the Son of God, the Savior of the world, the one who can save you from your sins, to confess your faith in Him as the Son of God, to repent of your sins, and to be baptized in water for the remission of sins. The water is ready. We are ready to help in any way that we can. Are you ready? Whatever you need to do to be right with God, won't you please come while we stand and sing the invitation song?